January 31, 1945. Clark Air Base, Philippines. Major Frank McCoy stood before an aircraft that would change everything American intelligence believed about Japanese aviation. The bomber sat on the tarmac, completely intact. Not a crash survivor. Not battle-damaged wreckage. A fully operational Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, tail number 763-12, abandoned by its crew during the American advance. McCoy had examined dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft across the Pacific. He'd studied their engines, analyzed their weapon systems, documented their construction methods. But nothing prepared him for what he was about to discover. He climbed through the inspection panels into the wings. His flashlight swept across the fuel tank compartments, and then he stopped. "This cannot be their standard design," he muttered into his recorder. "No Air Force would build bombers this way." The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compounds, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind. Just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. This wasn't battle damage. This wasn't a field modification. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate design. And it would explain why American pilots had been calling the Betty bomber the flying lighter for 3 years. Why they'd watched these aircraft explode into fireballs from just a few bullets. Why Japanese crews died in overwhelming numbers, even when American pilots claimed easy victories. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape American understanding of Japanese military doctrine. Every assumption about enemy aircraft design, about the value imperial forces placed on crew survival, about the price Japanese engineers were willing to pay for performance, was about to be systematically destroyed by the evidence contained within this single pristine bomber. This is the story of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty, Japan's most important land-based bomber and Japan's most deadly flying coffin. The Betty bomber's war began with spectacular success. December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M Betty bombers and 26 older G3M bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa. Their target, Clark Field in the Philippines, the primary American air base in the Pacific. The Japanese formation achieved complete tactical surprise. They arrived at 12:35 in the afternoon. Most American aircraft were on the ground. Pilots were at lunch. The base was completely unprepared. The Betty bombers flew at 20,000 feet, beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. They circled once, calmly, choosing their targets. Then they struck. 636 bombs fell across Clark Field's runways and facilities. The explosions were methodical, systematic, devastating. Moments later, Zero fighters swept in at treetop level. Their machine guns destroyed every aircraft that had survived the bombing run. Of 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were obliterated. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated.
Lieutenant James Harrington watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew to the north. He would later write in his combat report, "What struck me was the precision. Perfect formation flying, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and methodically tore us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. The Betty bombers themselves departed untouched. Not a scratch on them. The few American fighters that managed to scramble arrived too late, finding only empty sky." The Japanese had demonstrated something revolutionary. Their bombers could strike from bases 460 miles away, a feat no American bomber could match at that stage of the war. The Betty's extraordinary range had just changed the strategic equation of the Pacific War. But that same range, that same performance that seemed so miraculous, came with a price that would only become apparent when American fighters learned to intercept these formations, a price paid in Japanese blood.
2 days after Clark Field, the Betty bomber achieved something even more spectacular. December 10, 1941, the South China Sea. 26 G4M Betty bombers joined with older G3M bombers to attack Force Z, a British naval task force built around 2 of the most powerful warships in the world. HMS Prince of Wales, a brand-new battleship displacing 43,000 tons, the pride of the Royal Navy. HMS Repulse, a battle cruiser modernized in the 1930s, fast and deadly. These were not merchant ships. These were capital ships, the backbone of naval power, designed to survive everything the ocean could throw at them. And they were about to be destroyed by aircraft. The attack began at 12:20 in the afternoon. The Betty bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with precision that stunned British observers. Each Betty carried a Type 91 aerial torpedo, 840 kilograms of death, designed specifically for shallow water operations. The torpedo attacks focused on the 2 capital ships with devastating accuracy. Prince of Wales took at least 6 torpedo hits. The underwater explosions ripped massive holes in the ship's hull. Water flooded the engine rooms. The battleship began listing severely. Repulse absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while desperately attempting to evade. The ship's anti-aircraft fire was intense, claiming several Japanese aircraft, but it couldn't stop the coordinated attack. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours. Prince of Wales went down at 1:20 p.m. Repulse followed 13 minutes later. 841 British sailors died. The engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power while in open sea. The Betty bomber had achieved what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Admiral Tom Phillips, commander of Force Z, went down with Prince of Wales. His final signal to the Admiralty was simple: enemy aircraft bombing. The age of the battleship was over. The age of air power had begun. And the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber had just announced that new age to the world. But already, the seeds of the Betty's destruction were being planted.
Through the first 6 months of 1942, the Betty bomber seemed unstoppable. It hit Darwin, Australia, from bases 1,500 miles away. It attacked Port Moresby across New Guinea's mountain ranges. It struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles. The Betty's operational range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders couldn't counter. American fighters based at forward positions simply couldn't intercept Betty bombers departing from distant bases. Allied airfields came under attack from Japanese bases that were themselves beyond Allied striking range. The Betty participated in virtually every Japanese offensive operation across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Philippines, Malaya, Netherlands East Indies, New Guinea, Solomon Islands. It was everywhere, striking at will, operating beyond Allied reach. But this advantage depended entirely on one critical condition: limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could strike without interception, when they could approach targets at high altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when they could deliver weapons and depart before fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions characterized the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength remained limited and dispersed. But American fighter strength was building. New aircraft were arriving. Pilot training was improving. Tactical doctrine was evolving. And Betty crews were about to discover what their aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks really meant in sustained combat. The nickname Betty itself came from Allied intelligence services, who assigned code names to Japanese aircraft for easy identification. Bombers received female names. Fighters received male names. The Japanese called it the Type 1 attack bomber. American pilots would soon call it something else entirely. The flying lighter, the one-shot Zippo, the flying coffin. Because by mid-1942, the tactical picture was changing, and the Betty bomber's greatest weakness was about to be exposed in the most brutal way possible, at a place called Guadalcanal. August 8, 1942, a date that would live in infamy for Japanese Betty bomber crews. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal, a routine mission. 600 miles to target, deliver weapons, return home. The crews were experienced. The aircraft were well maintained. The weather was clear. Everything seemed normal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. What happened next shocked both sides. In the engagement that followed, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died. 18 out of 23 in a single mission. Fighter pilots reported the same observation again and again. The Betty explodes into flames with just a few hits, 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and the whole aircraft blooms into fire. This wasn't an anomaly. This wasn't bad luck. This was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat with horrifying consistency. August 9th, more Betty bombers lost. August 10th, more losses. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued striking American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces needed to strike American positions to contest control of the island. Betty bombers provided the only means of delivering meaningful strike capability from Rabaul. But every mission resulted in losses that could not be replaced. October saw the pattern continue. American fighter strength increased as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit Betty vulnerabilities more effectively. Japanese losses accelerated. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men dead. 700 men dead in 3 months. For context, that's more than the entire crew complement of a battleship, more than the population of a small town, all gone. And the exchange rate was catastrophic. The unprotected fuel tanks meant there was no middle ground, no wounded bombers limping home, no damaged but survivable aircraft. Betty bombers either returned untouched or exploded in flames.
Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal in October 1942. Commanding VF-17, flying F-4U Corsairs. His squadron quickly learned to hunt Betty bombers. First time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easy they went down, Blackburn later reported. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and they'd explode, just burst into flames. No smoke, no gradual fire spread. Instant conflagration. We actively hunted them after that, recognized them as among the most vulnerable targets in Pacific skies. Some of the guys felt bad about it, honestly. It wasn't really fair. But war isn't about fair. Another pilot, whose name was redacted in combat reports, wrote, "You could see the Betty crews trying to evade. Banking hard, changing altitude, desperate maneuvers. But the moment you hit them, it was over. The whole wing would light up like a Roman candle. Sometimes you'd see crew members trying to bail out, but the fire spread so fast they never had a chance. I once saw a Betty take a single .50 caliber round through the wing. One round, the whole aircraft exploded 3 seconds later, just disintegrated in midair. There couldn't have been anything bigger than a briefcase." Japanese survivors told similar stories from the other side. Flight Petty Officer Masato, who completed 28 combat missions before being transferred to training duties, gave a post-war interview. Every mission, we knew we might not return. The American fighters were everywhere. Once they found us, we were dead. The question wasn't if we would be hit. The question was whether we would explode instantly or have a few seconds to pray. I saw friends disappear in fireballs. I saw entire formations wiped out. I saw men burning alive, trapped in aircraft that had become flying furnaces. And we kept flying because we were ordered to fly. The Americans called us brave. We weren't brave. We were trapped in flying coffins, and military discipline demanded we climb into them anyway. Another Japanese crew member, interviewed by Allied intelligence after capture. We called it the hamaki, the cigar, because it looked like a cigar, and because it burned like one. Light it at one end, and the whole thing burns until there's nothing left. Before every mission, we wrote farewell letters. We said goodbye to our families, because the Betty didn't bring you home wounded. It brought you home dead, or it didn't bring you home at all.
November 1942, Buna, Papua New Guinea. Australian forces overran Japanese airfields, capturing several abandoned Betty bombers in various states of damage. Allied technical air intelligence units arrived to examine the aircraft. What they discovered confirmed what pilots had been reporting. The fuel tanks had absolutely no protection whatsoever. Aeronautical engineers crawled through the wing access panels with flashlights and measuring tools. They documented everything: construction methods, materials, fuel cell design, safety systems. Or rather, the complete absence of safety systems. The wing fuel cells were simple aluminum construction. No rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no redundant safety measures of any kind. One engineer wrote in his report, "The fuel tank construction is essentially identical to a standard aviation fuel drum, but integrated into the wing structure. There is no more protection than if the crew were flying with 50-gallon drums of gasoline strapped to the wings." We examined multiple Betty bombers at Buna. All showed identical characteristics. This wasn't an experimental aircraft. This wasn't a prototype. This was production standard. Japanese engineers had made a choice: performance over protection, range over survival, and thousands of men were dying because of that choice.
The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 provided the most complete technical analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. Their report, classified secret and distributed to all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that explained everything. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for range and speed. Empty weight, 6,741 kilograms, remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight, 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity, 4,780 liters, distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the wing's center section, where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. Top speed, 428 kilometers per hour, approximately 265 miles per hour. Maximum range, 6,034 kilometers, over 3,700 miles. That range was extraordinary. No Allied bomber could match it in 1941. For comparison, the B-17E Flying Fortress had a maximum range of about 2,000 miles. The B-24 Liberator managed about 2,800 miles. The Betty could fly over 3,700 miles, 50% farther than the best American bombers. But the American engineers immediately understood the price. The fuel system design was particularly revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in groups positioned where the wing joined the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity by utilizing the thickest portion of the wing's structure. But it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum construction provided no protection. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant even small punctures would leak fuel continuously. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. 500 kilograms. That's over 1,000 pounds. That weight savings translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range, but the cost in vulnerability was equally calculable. Combat reports showed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers termed a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. One engineer's analysis concluded, "The Betty bomber represents a design philosophy fundamentally incompatible with sustained combat operations. The aircraft can deliver weapons to distant targets if unopposed, but any combat damage to the wing structure results in catastrophic fuel system failure and immediate loss of aircraft and crew. This is not a flaw. This is intentional design." Japanese engineers understood these trade-offs and accepted them. The question was, why? September 1937. Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. The Navy issued requirements for a new land-based attack bomber that would define Japanese aviation doctrine for the next decade. The specifications were extraordinary. Top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, range of 4,722 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. These requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the range of carrier aircraft. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short.
The G4M bomber had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers had even more limited range. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. The requirements weren't arbitrary. They were calculated based on distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict. From Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles. From Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. The bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan strategic reach that no other nation possessed. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s. He understood European aeronautical engineering. He knew what Western air forces considered essential. And he immediately understood that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never accept. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity, nearly 5,000 liters. That fuel weighed approximately 4,000 kilograms at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating would add hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks required rubber compounds and additional structure. Fire suppression systems added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving the required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G4M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance.
Kiro Honjo understood what he was doing. His team calculated the vulnerabilities. They knew combat damage to the wings would likely prove catastrophic. They understood the risks. But they also knew the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with available technology. The choice was stark: an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. His design eliminated every non-essential system. No self-sealing fuel tanks, no armor plating around fuel cells, no fire suppression systems beyond basic extinguishers, no redundant safety measures, no protective redundancies of any kind. Every kilogram saved was invested in fuel capacity and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, with Mitsubishi building aircraft at plants in Nagoya. Initial production began in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. And thousands of men would die in them. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese engineers revealed the depth of their understanding. "We knew the aircraft was vulnerable," one engineer admitted. "We calculated the risks. We presented multiple design options to the Navy, including variants with reduced range but improved protection. The Navy rejected every protected variant. They insisted on maximum range. They told us that Japanese tactical superiority and fighting spirit would compensate for any vulnerabilities. We built what they demanded, and we watched thousands of aviators die in the aircraft we created." Another engineer: "After the war, American engineers asked me why we didn't include self-sealing tanks. I showed them the calculations. With self-sealing tanks and adequate protection, the Betty's range would have been reduced to less than 3,000 kilometers. The Navy's requirements couldn't be met with protection. We could build a protected bomber with limited range or an unprotected bomber with extraordinary range. There was no third option with 1937 technology. We chose range because that's what the Navy demanded. And every man who died in a Betty died because we made that choice. The decision wasn't lightly made, but it was made. And the consequences would be written in fire across Pacific skies."
April 18, 1943. The Betty bomber became the instrument of Admiral Yamamoto's death. The architect of Pearl Harbor, Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, the man Americans feared most. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications indicating Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville. He would travel aboard a G4M Betty bomber with fighter escort. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters were assigned to intercept. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would fly over 400 miles at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at exactly the calculated time. Any error would result in mission failure. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 7:25 a.m., flying 50 feet above the ocean for over 400 miles in strict radio silence. At 9:34 a.m., exactly on schedule and exactly where predicted, they spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lamphere and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke formation to engage the bombers while other P-38s held off the Zeros. Barber engaged the lead Betty, which carried Admiral Yamamoto. The bomber took hits to the wing area, where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed into the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash. The second Betty bomber also crashed, killing all aboard. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority. American signals intelligence, precise navigation, flawless execution. But most importantly, it demonstrated the Betty's fundamental vulnerability. There was no possibility of Yamamoto's bomber surviving once it came under attack. The unprotected fuel tanks ensured that any damage would be catastrophic. Japanese forces tried everything to protect high-value passengers. They provided fighter escorts. They flew at low altitude to avoid radar detection. They varied routes and timing. None of it mattered. Once American fighters intercepted a Betty bomber, the outcome was predetermined. The aircraft would explode. The passengers would die. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months but couldn't win a protracted war against American industrial might, died because the bomber he flew in had been designed with the same philosophy that was losing Japan the war. Performance over protection. Capability over survival. 6 months of running wild had passed. American industrial might was now crushing Japan, and the Betty bomber, once a symbol of Japanese air power, had become a flying coffin even for admirals.
By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30-millimeter rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. These sheets weren't true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise measure, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers. But crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They couldn't prevent fires from larger rounds or cannon shells. They couldn't stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks, with capacity reduced to accommodate the leak-blocking material. Maximum range decreased to 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original model. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. 60 aircraft, out of thousands produced. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect combat outcomes. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. Surviving Japanese crew members were unanimous in their assessment. The modifications were meaningless, one pilot stated. The rubber sheets gave us false hope, nothing more. We still exploded when hit. We still died in overwhelming numbers. The Model 3 with real self-sealing tanks. We called it too little, too late, too few. By the time it arrived, American fighters owned the skies. It didn't matter if our tanks were protected when we couldn't get anywhere near our targets. Another crew member, the modifications were an admission that the original design had been fatally flawed. But admitting the flaw didn't fix it. The Betty was unfixable. Its fundamental design philosophy was wrong, and no modification could change that. The statistics supported these assessments. Loss rates for modified Betty bombers remained catastrophic. The improvements were marginal at best, meaningless in practice. Japanese aviation doctrine had locked itself into a dead end. The requirements that created the Betty couldn't be changed. The performance that those requirements demanded couldn't be achieved with adequate protection. And the war wouldn't wait for new designs. So Betty crews continued flying, continued dying in aircraft that everyone knew were death traps.
March 21st, 1945. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic and tragic demonstration. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base. Each carried an MXY-7 Oka beneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted, rocket-powered aircraft with a 1,200-kilogram warhead, a kamikaze weapon designed for one-way missions against American ships. The mission required Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka. The Oka pilot would then ignite the rocket motor and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour. The warhead's massive explosive charge would destroy any vessel it struck. But the mission depended entirely on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach release range. The formation departed from Kanoya at 2:30 p.m. 18 bombers in tight formation with fighter escort, heading toward American naval forces off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and drag. They were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. The Hellcats reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range. What followed was a massacre. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, proved completely helpless while carrying Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. And the unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. American pilots reported it was almost too easy, like shooting practice targets. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members died. 15 Oka pilots died. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets could not survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when the aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. It was a perfect encapsulation of Japan's entire strategic situation by March 1945. Brilliant planning, innovative weapons, brave crews willing to die for the mission. None of it mattered when the fundamental tools were fatally flawed.
Total Betty bomber production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants. The G4M Model 1, with completely unprotected fuel tanks, comprised about 1,172 aircraft. Produced from 1941 through early 1943. The G4M Model 2, with slightly increased fuel capacity but still unprotected tanks, accounted for approximately 1,142 aircraft, produced from 1943 through 1945. The G4M Model 3, the only variant with actual self-sealing tanks, saw only 60 to 91 aircraft completed by war's end. These production numbers made the Betty one of Japan's most numerous bombers. But production statistics tell only part of the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained in service. The aircraft that had numbered in hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to dozens by attrition that no amount of production could replace. Casualty statistics among Betty crews were similarly devastating. Exact numbers remain difficult to verify, but what is certain is that thousands of Japanese aircrew died in Betty bombers. One Japanese aviation historian estimated that over 60% of all Betty crew members died in combat. That's 6 out of every 8 men who flew the aircraft. For comparison, American bomber crews in Europe suffered loss rates around 10 to 15%. Terrible, but survivable for the force as a whole. 60% losses are unsustainable, catastrophic, a death sentence for the force. Surviving Betty crews understood these odds. They flew anyway because military discipline and cultural values demanded they accept the risks. Former Flight Petty Officer Masato, who survived 28 missions, offered perhaps the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. I survived through pure luck. Nothing I did, no skill I possessed made any difference. You were hit or you weren't. If you were hit, you died. There was no middle ground. By 1944, climbing into a Betty felt like climbing into your own coffin. You said goodbye to your family before every mission because you knew you probably wouldn't return. And you were right more often than you were wrong.
January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Philippines. Major Frank McCoy stood back from tail number 76312, his examination complete. 3 weeks of dismantling, measuring, documenting. 3 weeks of understanding. The report he would file would be classified secret, but the truth it contained was devastatingly simple. The Betty bomber wasn't poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to meet impossible requirements. And those requirements had killed thousands of Japanese airmen. The unprotected fuel tanks weren't an accident. They were a choice, a calculated trade-off that Japanese engineers understood completely when they made it in 1937. Range or protection, performance or survival, mission capability or crew safety. They chose range, they chose performance, they chose the mission, and thousands of men paid the price. By the numbers, the Betty was one of the most capable bombers of World War II.
maximum range of over 3,700 miles, top speed of 265 miles per hour, able to carry torpedoes or bombs across distances no other aircraft could match. It sank the battleship HMS Prince of Wales. It destroyed HMS Repulse. It devastated Clark Field on December 8, 1941. It ranged across the Pacific, striking targets from Darwin to Guadalcanal, from the Philippines to New Guinea. But by the numbers, it was also one of the most deadly aircraft to its own crews. Over 60% casualty rate among Betty crews. Approximately 2,400 aircraft produced. The vast majority destroyed in combat, few surviving to war's end. The Betty that achieved spectacular success in December 1941 became a flying coffin by 1943. The same aircraft, the same capabilities, but the war had changed. American fighter strength increased. Interception became routine, and the unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that every hit was likely fatal. The contrast with American bombers was stark. The B-17 Flying Fortress was heavier, slower, shorter ranged than the Betty, but it had self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection, fire suppression systems, redundant safety measures. American bombers brought their crews home, even when damaged, even when shot up. The protection systems gave crews a chance to survive. Betty bombers exploded. There was no middle ground, no wounded aircraft limping home. You either returned untouched or you died. The difference wasn't in engineering skill. Japanese engineers were brilliant. American engineers were brilliant. Both created exactly what their militaries demanded. The difference was in what their militaries demanded. American doctrine said, protect the crews. Trained pilots are irreplaceable. Aircraft can be built in factories, but experience, skill, institutional knowledge, those can't be mass-produced. Invest in survivability.
Japanese doctrine said, accomplish the mission, strike at maximum range, achieve what the enemy believes is impossible. If crews die in the process, their sacrifice serves the emperor. Honor demands accepting the risk. Neither philosophy was inherently wrong, but one proved sustainable in prolonged war. The other didn't. The Betty's story is ultimately about strategic miscalculation. Japan designed an aircraft for a war they expected, quick, decisive, ending before industrial disparities mattered. The Betty was optimized for that war. First strike, maximum range, devastating capability. But that's not the war Japan fought. The war was prolonged, attritional. Industrial capacity became decisive, and an aircraft designed for sprint warfare couldn't survive marathon struggle. Admiral Yamamoto understood this. His famous warning about running wild for 6 months or 12 months, but having no confidence thereafter, proved prophetic. The Betty bomber embodied both parts of that prediction. For 6 months, it ran wild, unstoppable, devastating, seemingly invincible. Then American industrial might awakened. Fighter strength increased. Interception became routine. And the Betty's vulnerabilities became fatal. By 1943, Climbing into a Betty bomber meant accepting that you probably wouldn't come home. By 1944, it meant accepting that you almost certainly wouldn't survive. Crews knew this. Engineers knew this. Commanders knew this. They flew anyway because duty demanded it, because military discipline required it, because there was no alternative. Some call this courage, others call it tragedy. Perhaps it's both. August 19th, 1945. 4 days after Japan's surrender, 2 white-painted Betty bombers with green crosses took off from Atsugi Airfield. Call signs Baton 1 and Baton 2, carrying Japan's surrender delegation to meet with Allied forces. The symbolism was perfect and terrible. The aircraft that opened the Pacific War by destroying American air power at Clark Field now carried Japan's defeat back to that same field. The bomber that symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized submission and surrender. The circle was complete. From weapon of surprise attack to instrument of surrender, from symbol of Japanese military might to reminder of strategic failure.
The white paint transformed the Betty from weapon to messenger. But it couldn't erase what the aircraft represented. Couldn't erase the thousands who died in them. Couldn't change the fundamental truth about its design. Performance without survivability is ultimately self-defeating. Capability divorced from protection serves no one. The extraordinary range meant nothing when aircraft exploded before reaching targets. Major McCoy understood this as he looked at tail number 763-12 one final time. The Betty bomber wasn't evil. It was just a machine, built to specifications, performing exactly as designed. The tragedy wasn't in the aircraft. It was in the requirements that created it. Requirements based on strategic assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. Assumptions about the nature of the war Japan would fight. Assumptions about how quickly it would end. Assumptions about what risks were acceptable. Those assumptions killed thousands of men. Not the Americans who shot them down, not the fighters who intercepted them. The assumptions, the requirements, the choices made in 1937 by men who thought they understood what was coming. They didn't understand, couldn't understand. The war Japan expected never happened. The war Japan got destroyed the aircraft designed for the war they imagined. That's the real lesson of the Betty bomber. Not that Japanese engineers were inferior. They weren't. Not that Japanese crews lacked courage. They didn't. Not that Japanese military doctrine was foolish. It wasn't, given what they believed about the coming war. The lesson is simpler and more profound. Strategic assumptions matter more than tactical capabilities. Design an aircraft for the wrong war, and no amount of engineering brilliance can save it, or the men who fly it. The Betty bomber was a magnificent aircraft that asked Japanese crews to die for its range, and they did. In overwhelming numbers, because duty demanded it, because they had no choice, because someone, somewhere, years before they ever climbed into a cockpit,
made a decision that their lives mattered less than performance specifications. That decision, more than any American fighter, more than any tactical failure, more than any individual engagement, determined the Betty's legacy. Not as a poorly designed aircraft, but as a brilliantly designed aircraft for a war that never happened. And in that gap between expectation and reality, thousands of Japanese airmen found their deaths. Major McCoy closed his report with a single observation. The Mitsubishi G4M represents the ultimate expression of performance-first design philosophy. It achieved extraordinary capabilities at the cost of crew survivability. American doctrine will continue to prioritize protection systems, accepting performance penalties as necessary costs for preserving trained personnel. The Japanese approach, while producing impressive capabilities, has proven unsustainable in prolonged combat operations. He didn't need to elaborate. The evidence was clear. 2,400 aircraft produced, few surviving to war's end, thousands of crew members dead. The numbers told the story. The unprotected fuel tanks told the story. The white-painted surrender aircraft told the story. The Betty bomber's legacy isn't about aviation engineering. It's about the human cost of strategic miscalculation. About what happens when performance is pursued without regard for survival. About the price of designing weapons for the war you expect rather than the war you get. That legacy echoes through military aviation to this day. Modern combat aircraft universally feature protection systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor, redundant systems, ejection seats. Because the lesson of the Betty bomber was learned in Japanese blood. Performance matters, but survivability matters more. Capability is meaningless if you can't survive to employ it. And protecting your own people is as important as striking your enemies, perhaps more important. The Betty bomber proved this through the deaths of thousands, a terrible proof, but an undeniable one. That's the final truth of tale number 763-12, sitting on the tarmac at Clark Field on January 31st, 1945. Not a bad aircraft, not a design failure, but a monument to strategic assumptions that proved fatally wrong, and to the thousands of brave men who paid the ultimate price for decisions made before they ever learned to fly.